Rain hammered the tin roof as my lawyer told me my sister sold our $750K family home without warning, while I sat in my dim apartment, Rhett Callahan, 52, an internal controller, staring at the buzzing fluorescent light and gripping the cold brass key in my pocket. Ever had family blindsided you like that? What would you have done? It was the kind of phone call you never forget, the kind where the sound itself feels heavy, as if every syllable carried the weight of some finality. The line buzzed a faint crackle of static before the lawyer's voice broke through, clipped and uneasy. Rhett, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your sister has sold the Oglethorpe house. The closing's already done. You weren't on the deed anymore, so legally there's nothing you can do to reverse it. His words stretched, each one landing like a dull hammer against my chest. I didn't respond right away, staring instead at the condensation running down my apartment window as the autumn rain in Savannah slicked the streets below. Somewhere beyond the muted city hum, the bells of St. Andrew's tolled the hour. Their sound drifted through the wet air and into the small, dim room, marking a moment I'd later think of as the day everything tilted. In my right hand, I could feel the old brass key, heavy, cool, and faintly slick with age. It had sat in my desk for years, a little scuffed, but always polished, a relic from the home that was the last anchor to my family's past. Now, with that call, it was just a keepsake for a place I no longer owned. The lawyer cleared his throat, as if searching for something softer to offer. She needed the funds, apparently. Paid off some personal debts. The sale price was $750,000 cash offer. The buyers already listed it with a development firm. I wish I had better news, Rhett. I truly do. I let the silence drag my thumb, tracing the shallow groove in the key's head, the familiar feel grounding me even as the walls of the room seemed to push inward. I finally muttered, "Thanks for calling," my voice low, more to end the conversation than acknowledge it. The line clicked dead, leaving me with the quiet hum of rain tapping the tin roof of the old building. I leaned back in my chair, the musty smell of damp envelopes stacked on the table reaching me like a whisper of every bill, every notice I hadn't had the energy to face these past weeks. The table was cluttered mortgage statements from years past, HOA fee reminders, even an unopened letter stamped in red ink from a property tax office. Lori had gone behind my back before, but selling the house we grew up in, felt different. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an erasure, a cold cutting away of the only thread still tying me to those years when things, if not easy, at least felt whole. I reached for the pile, sifting through papers, softened by humidity. Their corners curled the ink, bleeding faintly from where water had kissed the pages. I hadn't lived in that house for years, not since our parents passed, but it had been there steady, like a sentinel of something more than brick and mortar. As I spread the documents across the scarred table, my eyes caught on a crumpled note scribbled by my mother years ago, her grocery list tucked between an old HOA invoice and a tax bill. Bread, milk, pecans, ham, Rhett's favorite. The handwriting, looping and careful, stirred something sharp and warm in me, a reminder of evenings in that kitchen when the scent of roasted pecans filled the air, when laughter felt normal. That house wasn't just a property line. It was memory tradition, a history that Lori had traded for a wire transfer and a chance to hold her social circle together. I stood pacing the narrow room, the wooden floorboards creaking under my steps, and tried to imagine Lori's conversation with her realtor, her practiced charm, her manicured nails, tapping the counter as she justified the decision. She'd always had a talent for sounding unflappable, for making every choice feel inevitable. My mind flicked to her voice, the way she once told me, "You hold on to the past like it owes you something, Rhett. I've moved on. You should too." Maybe she believed it. Or maybe it was easier to pawn off the weight of our shared childhood than to carry it like I did brass key and all. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose shutters, and I caught the faint scent of wet asphalt mingling with the musk of my apartment. I set the key on the table, the sound of metal against wood sharper than I expected, and stared at it. My thumb still carried the faint metallic tang from holding it too tightly. That key was the only piece left of a chapter now officially closed, but in that moment it felt less like a keepsake and more like a starting pistol. I wasn't going to rant or make some theatrical scene. That was Lori's style, not mine. No, my moves would be quiet, deliberate the way I handled audits and financial investigations in my day job. Slow steps, paper trails, details lining up until the picture snapped into focus. I picked up the key again, rolling its weight in my palm, and let my mind settle on a single thought that felt steadier than any storm outside. If Lori thought she could cut me out, sweep away my connection to that house with one slick sail, maybe it was time I reminded her that erasure cuts both ways. I'd watched people crumble under bank notices, seen fortunes turn on a single clause. It didn't take rage to dismantle someone's kingdom, it just took patience and the right set of documents in the right hands. By the time I slid the stack of damp notices into a neat pile and tucked the key into my coat pocket, the rain had eased to a soft drizzle. The bells of St. Andrew's rang again, quieter now, almost like an afterthought, as I stood by the window and looked out over the darkening street. The lights in the distance blurred in the wet air halos against the fog, and somewhere in that hush, a clarity settled in me. If she thought she could erase me with one sail, maybe it was time I let the bank erase her instead. The street I once called home looked like it had been forgotten by time, the winter air sharpening every edge of neglect. As I steered the car slowly down Oglethorpe Avenue, the house that had been ours loomed at the corner, stripped of its warmth and memory. The tilted for sale sign creaked faintly in the breeze, its bottom edge splattered with mud. Grass had grown wild, reaching knee-height, and spilling across the cracked brick walkway, hiding the path where my mother once planted lanterns every December. The shutters sagged, paint peeling in curls that caught the pale winter sun. It didn't feel like the house we grew up in anymore, but seeing it in this state only hardened something in me. My fingers brushed against the brass key in my coat pocket, the metal still cold, as if it too sensed that the place it once commanded was slipping further into some stranger's hands. By the time I pulled into the lot at Savannah First National Bank, the morning drizzle had settled into a dull mist, coating the street lamps and windows in a sheen that made everything feel slightly unreal. The hum of the fluorescent lights inside hit me immediately, accompanied by the acrid scent of burnt coffee. Someone had clearly let the pot sit too long on the warmer. The lobby, as always, felt sterile, but the bulletin board near the teller line caught my eye. Notices in neat rows, delinquent accounts, public auction dates, HOA disputes. My eyes slid down the postings until one line froze me. Foreclosure auction Callahan property, West, Oglethorpe Avenue, scheduled for February 18th, 2022. Lori's pride, the mansion she preened about at every gathering, was already on the chopping block. I didn't smile, but the tightness in my chest loosened just a bit. Inside, Marcus Delaney sat behind his desk, shoulders hunched, tapping at his keyboard with the kind of frustration that comes from both the job and the people he had to deal with daily. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just grunted as he swiveled to a drawer and pulled out a worn ledger. A splash of stale coffee had seeped into the corner of the page, leaving a brown bloom over the typewritten list. "Your sister's overextended," he muttered, dabbing at the spill with a napkin, but making no real dent in the stain. "Delinquent mortgage, multiple credit card advances, and she's late on HOA assessments for the second quarter." Not my place to judge, but the numbers don't lie. She's circling the drain, Rhett. His tone carried no sympathy, but there wasn't a shred of glee either. It was just fact, cold and heavy. I stayed quiet, leaning over slightly to glance at the figures without making it obvious. Years in corporate audits had taught me how to absorb information without drawing attention, and old habits served me well now. Hypothetically, I said, keeping my voice even if someone were interested in acquiring the debt she owes. Marcus shot me a sidelong glance, eyebrow arched, then sighed. Hypothetically, you'd need to file a formal hold and purchase request. Won't be cheap, and you'll be on the hook for any liens attached. But if you've got the capital, the bank won't object. She's not exactly a prized client anymore. He slid a thin stack of forms across the desk, the paper still warm from the printer that had just spat them out, though not without a protest, as I'd heard its mechanical groan and stutter from the hallway moments earlier. I took the forms, the faint smell of toner and singed coffee clinging to them, and began filling them out at his side table. Every line I wrote felt deliberate, like I was sketching out the scaffolding of a quiet strategy rather than merely signing bureaucratic paperwork. My pen scratched softly against the page, the sound nearly lost under the persistent hum of the overhead lights. When I reached the line to sign, I paused the pen, hovering as a thought flickered through me. This wasn't about revenge, not fully, not yet. It was about control, about turning the same quiet mechanisms Lori had used to erase me back toward her. The weight of the brass key in my pocket reminded me that even as she'd sold away my history, she was about to lose the very present she flaunted. I pressed the pen to paper ink flowing steady as I signed my name, locking the hold request into motion. Marcus gathered the documents, stamped each one with a muted thud, and slid them back into a folder with the efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times over. You'll get confirmation within a week. Auction date stands unless she clears her balances, which... He let the unfinished sentence hang in the air, accompanied by a subtle shrug. I tucked the stamped folder into my coat, careful to slide the folded HOA bill I'd been carrying into the same pocket. Paper trails were as powerful as any key, maybe more so. Out in the hallway, I paused by the bulletin board again, staring for a moment at the auction notice under the harsh lighting. The edges of the paper curled slightly, as if even the sheet itself understood what was coming. Stepping back out into the misty air, I drew the brass key from my pocket and let it rest in my palm, the cool metal grounding me as I walked toward my car. The fog swirled around the street lamps, their light spilling into pale halos on the wet pavement. I traced the etched numbers on the key's shaft with my thumb, remembering the countless times it had turned a lock to a home now shuttered and empty. My reflection in the car window looked tired, but steady, the faint breath fogging the glass, a reminder that I was still here, still capable of steering the tide. As I slid behind the wheel and the heater whirred to life, a calm settled over me, the kind that comes only when a plan begins to take root. The brass key caught a glint from the dashboard light, its dull shine a whisper of what might come next. By this time next month, that key might open more than old memories. It might open my sister's gilded gates, and with them, the first step toward rewriting the balance between us. The old wooden doors of St. Andrew's Church gave a long, low groan as I pushed them open, the kind of sound that felt like an exhale from another century. Inside the fellowship hall was warm and dim, lit by candles that threw soft pools of light against the weathered walls. The faint, sweet scent of pecan wood smoke drifted in from outside, slipping under the doors with the laughter of children circling the autumn festival booths. Reverend Amos Whitaker rose from a chair near the front, his frame tall but bent by years of careful labor, his expression carrying that rare calm that always seemed to disarm me. His hand reached out not to shake mine, but to rest gently over the brass key sitting in my palm, as if the weight of the metal was something we both shared. "Your family built more than a house," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that blended with the faint organ notes humming from the sanctuary beyond. "They built a street's soul. The bricks, the porches, the lanterns. That's all more than property lines, Rhett. It's memory. It's community." I stood there, absorbing his words as the warmth from the hall eased into me, chasing away the lingering chill from the street outside. The flickering candlelight caught the polished surface of the key, drawing a glint that felt almost accusatory. I wanted to tell him I knew all that already, that I'd been carrying the weight of it for months, while Lori treated our past like a pawn ticket, but the words didn't form. Instead, I listened as he gestured for me to sit on one of the old oak benches, its surface worn smooth by generations of parishioners. The sound of faint music, just a soft hymn played on the organ, floated through the space, pairing with the distant crackle of pecan logs burning somewhere outside. There was comfort in it, a rhythm older and steadier than my frustrations. Rhett Amos said after a moment, settling across from me, his eyes fixed, but kind. "You can go after her if you want. Lord knows she's earned a reckoning. But don't let it stop there. If you're going to move all this weight money property, whatever it is, use it to build something, not just break something." His hand rested on his knee, fingers tapping softly, a habit I remembered from my youth when he used to visit my parents for Sunday dinners. "This district, it's been bleeding. Houses, empty shutters sagging. If someone like you could put a little backbone back into it, well, that would be a kind of justice even she couldn't argue with." Nash, his son, younger by a good 2 decades and carrying himself with a restless energy, stepped into the hall, then a clipboard under his arm. He nodded a greeting, his eyes darting between me and his father before he spoke. "Dad's right. You know the Savannah Heritage Fund. They've been looking for someone local to help spearhead projects. They're tired of outsiders flipping properties into vacation rentals. You buy Lori's debt, let the bank handle the foreclosure, and we channel that property into a community hub. Could be a food pantry, a job training center, whatever brings people back here." His voice was eager, maybe a bit too eager, but it sparked a thread of possibility in me that I hadn't considered before. I glanced down at the brass key again, rolling it between my fingers. It no longer felt like a reminder of something lost, but like a token of what could still be shaped. The idea of turning Lori's gleaming, hollow mansion into something that actually mattered made my jaw unclench for the first time in days. Without answering immediately, I pulled out my cracked phone, its screen webbed faintly from a drop months ago, and opened my email app. My thumbs moved slowly but deliberately as I drafted a message to the director of the Heritage Fund. The glow of the screen cast a pale light across the bench, highlighting the scratches in the old wood as I typed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying in a stronger waft of pecan smoke and the faint sizzle of something cooking on the grills. I paused mid-sentence, taking in the layered scents of barbecue and candle wax, the hum of voices beyond the hall, and thought about how far removed Lori's marble floors and curated soirees were from this place. And yet, they could be connected again, repurposed into something with roots, something that gave back rather than postured. That thought, unexpected but steady, settled deeper than the anger had. By the time I hit send, the draft reading Proposal Heritage Fund Partnership, I felt the first glimmer of something more than resentment taking shape. Amos nodded once knowingly, as though he could sense the shift without me saying a word. "Good," he murmured. "Now you're holding the key for a reason." His eyes flicked to the bit of brass glinting in my hand before drifting back to the flicker of the candles. As I stood to leave, Nash scribbled a date on his clipboard and tore off the page, pressing it into my palm. Auctions in February. We'll be ready. I folded the note and tucked it into my coat, alongside the key, their combined weight oddly comforting. The organ faded to silence, replaced by the distant call of a child laughing outside. I looked back at the hall one last time, the shadows deepening as the candles burned lower, and let the resolve settle in me like a tide. If I played my cards right, I wouldn't just settle a score, I'd rewrite what our family name stood for. The mansion caught the spring light like a polished mirror, every window reflecting the sky in sharp, perfect squares. But stepping inside, it felt like walking into a vault. The air was too still heavy with the cloying scent of lavender candles lit in every corner, as if someone was desperate to cover up the faint sourness lingering underneath polish hiding rot. The marble floors, cool beneath my shoes, gave off a subtle echo, with each step a hollow tone that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. I kept one hand in my coat pocket, fingers curling around the brass key, its worn edges biting faintly against my skin. That key, once the symbol of a house alive with warmth, laughter, and the smell of roasted pecans, had become just a shard of memory now, something Lori had stripped of meaning with one signature. I didn't come here to reminisce. I came to make certain I was done caring about her approval or her betrayal. Lori appeared at the top of the grand staircase framed by the ornate railing she'd had imported from Italy, her heels tapping a measured rhythm on the polished wood as she descended. She looked like the embodiment of the mansion itself, impeccable, glossy, and hollow at the core. "Rhett," she said, drawing my name out like a faint sigh. "You didn't call first. This is a bit unorthodox, even for you." Her voice carried the faintest tremor beneath the practiced poise, though she hid it behind a tight smile. She didn't offer me a seat, just let her heels click against the marble as she circled me like I was another one of her curated exhibits. "I didn't come to socialize," I said evenly, my tone controlled my gaze, fixed on the high ceilings rather than her smirk. "I came because you sold the Oglethorpe house out from under me, and I want to know if there's anything left here worth salvaging, or if we're done pretending to be family entirely." My words hung in the cavernous space, swallowed by the faint hum of the central air and the whisper of a distant clock somewhere in the hall. She laughed softly, a brittle sound. Oh, Rhett, always clinging to that drafty old relic like it was some sacred shrine. It was just a house, and you were too sentimental and frankly too cautious with your finances to do anything with it. I had debts to clear, a reputation to maintain. I did what needed to be done. Maybe if you stopped holding on to the past, you'd see that I saved us both some trouble. Her words struck their usual chords, but they didn't sting the same way they once had. I pulled the key from my pocket, holding it up so the soft light from the chandelier caught its dull shine.
"You think this is just a trinket too?
Something to be tossed aside like the rest of it?" I asked, my voice steady but edged.
"This isn't about a building, Lori. It's about every piece of our history you've turned into a bargaining chip."
For a flicker of a moment, something in her eyes shifted, fear maybe, or guilt, but it vanished behind a mask of disdain. She plucked the key from my hand without warning, rolling it between her manicured fingers as she arched a brow. "You're still carrying this, a rusty key to a house you don't own. That's pathetic, Rhett. Let me help you. Let go of it." Before I could react, she tossed it down onto the marble floor with a deliberate flick, the faint ping of metal against stone ringing out in the chilled air. I winced instinctively as the sound echoed through the vast room, and when I crouched to pick it up, I saw the slight bend in its shaft, the brass no longer perfectly straight. The sight of that warped metal should have stoked some flare of anger or grief, but instead, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The key was just an object, and now it would serve a new purpose. I turned it over in my hand once, feeling the altered weight, before sliding it back into my pocket. Lori crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway, her smirk back in place. "Face it, Rhett. You can hold on to memories, but they won't hold on to you. You either move on or you get left behind." I straightened, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Maybe. But the thing about the past, Lori, is it has a way of finding its footing again, especially when you least expect it." My tone was measured, not a threat, just a statement of fact. I took a slow breath, the lavender-sweet air now tinged with something acrid, like the faintest trace of cleaner beneath all the perfume. Turning away, I walked down the long hallway toward the exit, the echo of my steps mingling with hers as she followed at a distance. My fingers stayed curled around the bent key in my coat, its imperfect form pressing against my palm like a reminder. Sentimentality had its place, but strategy had to take over now. This wasn't about what we'd lost anymore. It was about what I was about to build, with, or without her standing in the way. The front doors opened to a rush of warm spring air, the faint scent of blooming azaleas cutting through the cloying lavender I left behind. I paused on the steps, glancing back at the immaculate facade of her mansion, all gleaming glass and sterile beauty, and felt no envy, no longing, only resolve. When I slid that warped brass into my coat, I knew the next time it surfaced, it wouldn't just be a memory, it'd be a statement. ChatGPT, done I. The Savannah Civic Center smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that clung to the scuffed linoleum floors, no matter how many times they were polished. The hum of overhead fans filled the pauses between murmurs, while the sunlight slanted through warped blinds, casting striped shadows across the folding tables lined up at the front. People sipped sweet tea from paper cups, their voices low and polite, the soft sounds of neighborly gossip blending into a casual hum until I stepped forward and let a heavy stack of stamped bank ledgers thud onto the center table. The room stilled as the weight of paper and embossed seals cut through the idle chatter, the sound louder than it should have been in that small, overheated space. Reverend Whitaker sat off to my right, his hands folded calmly over his lap. As the echo of the ledgers faded, the distant toll of the church bell drifted through an open side door, a soft, measured note that seemed to underline what was about to happen. I met his eyes briefly, and he gave the smallest nod, not encouragement, so much as affirmation that this moment was exactly as it needed to be. Lori was standing near the front, all polished poise, and practiced charm her summer dress the color of champagne, her chin tilted just so. She had been talking to a cluster of neighborhood association members, gesturing lightly with a manicured hand, the picture of composure. When she saw the ledgers, her smile flickered, not enough for most to notice, but enough for me to catch. "What's this?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, though the slight edge beneath it betrayed her. The room's attention shifted from her to me in a slow, deliberate wave. I thought I said evenly, keeping my tone low, that everyone here might want to understand the stakes before today's meeting continues. Specifically, the financial state of Ms. Callahan's property. I didn't glance at Lori as I spoke, just opened the folder and pulled out a document stamped with the bank's insignia. Marcus Delaney stepped forward, then his expression flat, his voice dry as he cleared his throat. "As of June 15th,
2022, Ms. Callahan's mortgage is in default,
he read aloud. Eyes on the page with a delinquent balance of $238,000. Compounded by unpaid HOA fees and credit obligations. The mortgage note was lawfully purchased by Mr. Rhett Callahan as of June 10, granting him the full rights of lien holder. A murmur rolled through the hall like a gust of wind, the kind that moves curtains without opening a window. Chairs scraped softly as people shifted whispers, threading from one row to the next. Lori's posture stiffened. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag until her knuckles whitened. Under the harsh fluorescence, her confident glow dimmed, and for the first time in years, she looked smaller, her composure hairline cracked. Marcus continued flipping to another page. Per the foreclosure clauses, unless the balances are satisfied in full before the auction date, the property will transfer ownership at public sale. The embossed seal on the deed caught a sliver of sunlight, throwing a brief gleam across the tabletop, before the blinds shifted and the room dimmed again. No one raised their voice. Not Marcus, not me. I didn't gloat, didn't let any satisfaction creep into my expression. I just stood, hands resting lightly on the ledgers, letting the documents, the hard-stamped truth, do all the work. Lori's gaze darted around the room, searching for someone to meet her eyes, someone to reassure her, but no one offered. The queen of Oglethorpe Avenue had been reduced to silence by nothing more than paper ink and a clause she couldn't charm her way around. I glanced once more toward Reverend Whitaker, who remained as calm as he'd been at the start, his presence a steady anchor in the quiet storm I'd just unleashed. Then I looked back down at the folder, running my hand along the cool, ridged edge of the embossed seal, and stepped back from the table. I didn't raise my voice. Not once. I just let the stamped pages do the talking. A sudden downpour rolled in without warning, the heavy summer rain drumming against the Civic Center roof until it sounded like 1,000 muted drums above us. The lights had been dimmed for the evening session, casting the hall in a soft amber hue, and through the tall windows lining the back wall, I could see the streets outside shining like mirrors, slick and glistening under the storm. The faint tap of rain on glass blended with the restless shifting of townsfolk in their seats, damp jackets releasing the earthy scent of wet fabric into the room. At the center, Lori's voice wavered, not in volume, but in tone, as she stood before the cluster of neighbors, hands outstretched like a conductor trying to summon a symphony. "This is what he's doing," she said, her voice catching at the edges. "My own brother, trying to dismantle our family's legacy out of spite. He bought my debt just to humiliate me. You all know me. I've hosted your fundraisers, kept our street alive when no one else would. And now he wants to tear it all down, hand it over to strangers." Her words rippled across the room, drawing a few hesitant murmurs, though most faces stayed unreadable waiting. The rain's rhythm filled the silence after she stopped a steady pulse like a clock counting down. Reverend Whitaker rose slowly from his seat, the brass of his cufflinks catching the faint light as he straightened his jacket. His calm presence alone seemed to still the air. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture dramatically. He just walked to the center and placed his hand gently on the edge of the table. "Folks," he began, his tone deep and even. "I've known this family all my life, and I've seen what's happened these past years. Lori's debts aren't some mystery cooked up by Rhett here. They're public record mortgages, unpaid credit lines, stacked HOA dues left hanging. And while the street dimmed, while houses stood empty, she poured money into soirees and surface shine. That isn't preserving a legacy. That's hollowing it out. His words, soft as they were landed like slow, deliberate hammer strikes, leaving no room for rebuttal. I stepped forward, then feeling the bent brass key warm in my pocket, a reminder of everything that had been broken and still might be reshaped. This isn't about revenge, I said, my voice measured, carrying just enough to reach the back row. It's about rebuilding. Not just a house, but a block, a neighborhood that deserves more than to be gutted and flipped for vacation rentals. I nodded toward Nash, who stood by the projector, quietly clicking to bring the first slide to life on the wall behind me. The hum of the machine joined the soft percussion of rain as the image came into focus, a rendering of Laurie's mansion, transformed no longer a cold monument to one person's pride, but a vibrant arts and resource center, open doors, community gardens, a place with lights on at every hour. The crowd shifted, leaning forward, whispers turning into quiet approval as the images scrolled. A food pantry, a small library, outdoor space for local markets and music nights. For the first time all evening, Laurie's voice faltered into silence. Whatever protest she had ready died as a swell of applause rose from the seats, hesitant at first, then firm. The sound echoed through the hall, bouncing off the wooden beams overhead, washing over her like a tide she couldn't stop. I stayed still, my hands at my sides, letting the room absorb the vision rather than push it. Laurie's shoulders dropped her gaze, falling to the polished floor where the reflections of the slides flickered faintly. Her isolation wasn't a spectacle. It was quiet, the natural shift of a room, realizing who was truly standing for something beyond themselves. As the applause tapered into a low, steady hum, I reached into my coat and let my fingers close around the bent brass key. Its curve pressed into my palm, not sharp, but firm, a reminder of where this had started and where it would end. I knew it wouldn't stay crooked much longer. The forge hissed as sparks lit the dim shop, each hammer strike shaping the brass key back into form. The air smelled of iron and heat, layered with the faint sweetness of a glass of tea cooling on the workbench. I stood by the wall, listening to Reverend Whitaker's quiet words. Sometimes you don't fix things to use them, Rhett, but to remember what they mean. At the table, Nash spread the Heritage Fund papers, the pages rustling under the desk fan's steady hum. I signed each line as the blacksmith quenched the key steam curling into the rafters. Reverend's hand on my shoulder grounded me.
Not revenge,
He said softly.
a foundation.
The blacksmith placed the polished, straightened key in my palm. Cool now, it felt lighter but more important than ever. I slipped it into my coat, knowing tomorrow it wouldn't be mine alone. It would hang for everyone to see what survived. Jazz drifted through the courtyard as strings of lights lit the winter sky. The old mansion, now the Savannah Heritage Center, buzzed with neighbors sharing food, children laughing, and the smell of barbecue in the air. Inside, the brass key hung on a cedar plaque above the desk, catching the warm glow and reflecting softly across the room. I stepped to the podium, keeping my words simple. Sometimes justice doesn't burn things down. Sometimes it builds something better. The applause was gentle but steady, a sound of relief more than celebration. At the back, Laurie stood alone, quiet, her usual defiance gone. No words passed, just a silent truce as the evening light faded. The last sunbeam caught the brass key, making it shine like a promise. It wasn't an ending. it was the start of something worth keeping alive. The last of the evening light caught the polished brass key on its cedar mount, glinting softly as the crowd drifted home. Standing there, I thought about how far we'd all come from broken bonds and bent edges to something whole again. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it's just finding a way to build where things once fell apart. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone feeling gutted by loss, a job, a home, even family ties know there's a way forward, though it rarely looks how we expect. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share it below. I'd like to hear your story, and if you'd like more reflections like this, feel free to follow along.